United States, fuel efficiency laws for vehicles sold on the U.S. market are set by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA. They set the Corporate Average Fuel Economy, or CAFE, standards by which vehicle makers have to abide, and that, in turn, establishes the minimum standards for companies like Ford or Toyota making vehicles for this market. That CAFE standard is paired with another guideline set by the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, that sets standards related to tailpipe emissions. The former says how many miles a vehicle should be able to travel on a gallon of fuel, while the latter, EPA standard, says how much CO2, methane, and other pollutants can be legally emitted as that fuel is burnt and those miles are traversed. These two standards address different angles of this issue, but work together to, over time, reduce the amount of fuel consumed to do the same work, and pollution created as that work is accomplished. As a result, if you are traveling 50 miles today and driving a modern car in the United States, you will consume a lot less fuel and produce far fewer pollutants than you would have traveling the same distance in a period-appropriate car 20 years ago. Back in the final year of the Biden administration, 2024, the president was criticized for not pushing for more stringent fuel efficiency standards for U.S. sold and driven vehicles. The fuel economy requirements were increased by 2% per year for the model years 2027 through 2031 for passenger cars, and the same 2% per year requirement will be applied to SUVs and other light trucks for model years 2029 to 2031. This is significantly lower than a previously proposed efficiency requirement, which would have seen new vehicles averaging about 43.5 miles per gallon by model year 2032, an efficiency gain of 18%. And the explanation at the time was that Biden really wanted to incentivize car makers to shift to electric vehicles, and if they were not spending their time and resources on fuel efficiency tech deployed in their gas guzzlers, which Biden hoped to start phasing out anyway, they could spend more of their time and energy and resources refining their EV offerings, which were already falling far behind China's EV models in pretty much every regard. Biden wanted half of all new vehicles sold in the United States by 2030 to be electric. So the theory was that fuel efficiency standards were kind of like fighting the previous war, and he wanted to fight the next one. Even those watered-down standards were estimated to keep almost 70 billion gallons of gasoline from being consumed through the year 2050, which in turn would reduce U.S. driver emissions by more than 710 million metric tons of CO2 by that same year. They were also expected to save U.S. drivers something like $600 in gas costs over the lifetime of each vehicle they own. Since current President Trump returned to office, however, all of these rules and standards have come into question. Just as when he was president the first time around, rolling back a bunch of Obama-era fuel efficiency standards, which, if implemented as planned, would have ensured U.S. sold vehicles averaged 46.7 miles per gallon by 2026, next year, so better than we were expected to get by 2032 under Biden's revised minimum. Just as he did back then, Trump is targeting these new Biden standards, while also doing away with a lot of the incentives introduced by the Biden administration, meant to make EVs cheaper and more appealing to consumers and easier to make and sell for car companies. What I'd like to talk about today is another standard, this one far less politicized and also widely popular within the US and beyond, that is also seemingly being targeted by the second Trump administration, and what might happen if it goes away. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. In 1992, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, under the endorsement of then-President George H.W. Bush, launched the Energy Star program. a voluntary labeling program that allowed manufacturers of various types of products to affix a little blue label that says Energy Star on their products, boxes, and/or advertising if their product met the efficiency standards set by this program. So it's a bit like if those aforementioned fuel efficiency standards for vehicles were not required, and instead, if your car met those minimum standards, you could just slap a little sticker on the car that says it was more energy efficient than cars without said sticker. A low bar to leap, and one that was not considered to be that big a deal, either in terms of being cumbersome for product makers, because they could just ignore it if they wanted to, or in terms of accomplishing much of anything. Energy Star standards were initially developed for the then burgeoning field of personal computers and computer accessories, but in 1995, things really took off when the program was expanded to include heating and cooling infrastructure, alongside other components for housing and buildings in general. From there, new product categories were added on a semi-regular basis, and the government agency folks running the program continued to deploy more technical support and testing tools, making it easier and easier for companies wanting to adhere to these standards to do so, relatively easily and inexpensively. And to provide a sense of what was required to meet Energy Star standards in the days when they were really beginning to take off and become popular, in the early 2000s, refrigerators needed to be about 20% more efficient in terms of electricity consumption than the minimum legal standard for that product category, while dishwashers needed to be about 41% more efficient. Computers around that time, more specifically in 2008, were required to have an 85% efficiency at half load, and something close to that at 20 and 100% power load, which basically means they needed to use most of the energy they drew from the grid and release less of that energy as waste heat, which was a big issue for desktop computers at the time. Energy Star TVs had used 30% less energy than the average, with more modern versions of that standard also requiring that they draw 3 watts or less while in standby mode, and a slew of 90s and early 2000s era technologies like VCRs and cordless home phones were required to use something like 90% less electricity than the average at the time. This standard helped push the development of more energy efficient everything, as it was a selling point for companies making things for real estate developers in particular, especially in those early days. Energy hogs like light fixtures, which would cost a fortune to power if you're thinking in terms of skyscrapers or building a bunch of houses, became far more energy efficient after the folks in charge of buying the lighting for these projects were able to eyeball options and use the Energy Star label as a shorthand indicator that the cost of operation for those goods would be far less over time than their competition. It was kind of pointless to buy anything else in many cases, because why would you want to spend all that extra money over time buying less energy efficient fluorescent lights for your office buildings, especially now that it was so easy to see at a glance which products were the best in that regard. And the same general consensus arrived on the consumer market not long after that, as qualified lighting was something like 75% more efficient than non-qualified legal minimum meeting lighting, the stuff that just hit the legal requirement to sell on the US market. And Energy Star verified homes were something like 20% cheaper to own. It was estimated that U.S. homeowners living in Energy Star certified homes saved around $360 million on their energy bills in 2016 alone. And another estimate suggests that U.S. citizens overall have saved about $500 billion over the past 33 years as a result of the program and the efficiency standards it has encouraged. So this is a relatively lightweight program that is optional and which basically just rewards companies willing to put more efficient products on the market. They can use the little label if they live up to these standards, and that tells customers that this stuff will use less energy than other comparable products, which in turn saves those customers money over time and puts less strain on the US electrical grid. This program consequently has been very popular for customers, for the companies making these products, because by jumping through a few hoops, they could get some of their products certified, and that gives them a competitive advantage over companies that don't do the same, and that's especially true over companies that sell cheaper goods made overseas, which tend to be a lot less efficient because of that cheapness and those slim margins. And it's been popular for politicians across the political spectrum, because people who buy things and pay energy bills vote those politicians into office, and companies that make these sorts of goods hire lobbyists to influence these politicians' decisions. All of which brings us to today, mid-May of 2025, a point at which the second Trump administration seems to be considering possibly getting rid of the Energy Star certification program. Initial reports on the matter are seemingly well-sourced but anonymous, as is the case with a lot of White House briefs right now. So some of this should be taken with a grain of salt because of how it's being reported, and because this administration has flip-flopped a whole lot already and on things much bigger and more prominent than this since returning to office. So this could just go away after being reported upon, even if they actually intended to do it before the resulting pushback. But what seems to have happened is this. In January of 2025, after returning to the White House, Trump's administration put a big Trump supporter and Republican politician, Lee Zeldin, in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. Zeldin publicly holds a lot of standard Republican talking points, including what's often called skepticism about climate science and vehement support for oil drilling, including fracking. He did say that climate change is a real issue that needs to be addressed during his EPA head confirmation hearing, though, which is something. Under Trump's second administration, many government agencies have been either completely done away with or wiped out in terms of funding and staff, so that they're basically just zombie agencies at this point. And the EPA is an agency that Trump has historically not been a big fan of, in which he seems to be trying to rewire toward deregulation. So regulations like fuel efficiency standards are not good according to some strains of usually more conservative politics, and for some business owners because these are additional rules that they have to legally abide by, which costs them money. Many companies disagree with that and would prefer to have legally mandated standards that makes them more competitive and which also ensures their competition will be investing in the same things. But the more libertarian wing of conservative parties, I think, are more likely to want to do away with regulations in general, as an ideological sort of thing. And back in March of 2025, Zeldin announced that the EPA would be pulling back on regulations related to power plants, would incentivize rather than disincentivize the production of oil and gas, would do away with a bunch of pollution-related standards, especially those related to coal power plants and how much pollution they're allowed to emit, and many other similar things, which, to shorthand all of this, may be somewhat popular if you think climate change concerns are overblown and that it's more important to keep coal mines operational than to keep streams and rivers clean, but which will generally look really, really bad if you're any kind of environmentalist and or are concerned about climate change. The government also recently cut the EPA's budget by 54.5%, dropping said budget back to where it was when Ronald Reagan was president. This cut, along with cuts to other agencies responsible for tracking dangerous weather, saving sea turtles, and keeping U.S. national parks clean and functional, will, according to the government, save U.S. taxpayers $163 billion. According to reports from a recent all-hands meeting of the EPA's Office of Atmospheric Protection, Trump administration officials announced that the office would be dissolved and that the Energy Star program would be eliminated. Now, there's a chance that this is just the result of the administration's at times seemingly blind cutting of budgets, backtracking only when there's sufficient pushback. And there's a chance that this is a continuation of a political moment a few years back when the Biden administration was hinting that they might do away with Energy Star certification for gas ranges, for ovens and stovetops that run on gas. The idea being that if it uses gas instead of electricity, that is a fossil fuel-based product, and therefore it's part of the problem, even if it's more efficient than other competing ranges. Republican politicians responded to lobbying efforts from the U.S. gas industry and stirred that up into a big frenzy, to the point that people were vehemently defending their right to own a gas stove, which is something that was never under threat. But that's how these sort of astroturfed moral panics work. And it could be that they are looking to replicate some of that previous magic now, taking down a standard that they hope to frame as an example of liberal overreach, telling people that these things take away their right to choose what they want to buy and how much energy or fuel they're allowed to burn, even when that's not actually true. It's an incentives program, not something that takes away anything from anyone. There's also a chance, as I mentioned earlier though, that this is just a trial balloon, and that once they realize there is a decent amount of bipartisan support for this program, they will step back from this cut and maybe even claim it for themselves, using it as an example of American exceptionalism. Look how great American-made goods are, we are more efficient than anybody else. Not bad messaging at a time in which that kind of competitive language is popular with those in charge, though that competition may not be the real point of all of this, at least for some of the people making some of these decisions right now. The book I'd like to recommend today is called Africa is Not a Country, Notes on a Bright Continent by Dipo Faloyan. This is a really lovely and enjoyable book, and I'd like to read the officially provided summary for it rather than coming up with my own summary, because it is so expansive and hits on so many different topics. I don't think my own summary would best this one that was officially provided by the publisher. That summary goes like this, quote, Africa is Not a Country is a bright portrait of modern Africa that pushes back against harmful stereotypes to tell a more comprehensive story. You already know these stereotypes. So often Africa is depicted simplistically as an arid red landscape of famines and safaris, uniquely plagued by poverty and strife. In this funny and insightful book, Dipo Faloyan offers a much-needed corrective. He examines each country's colonial heritage and explores a wide range of subjects, from chronicling urban life in Lagos and the lively West African rivalry over who makes the best jollof rice, to the story of democracy in 7 dictatorships and the dangers of stereotypes in popular culture. By turns intimate and political, Africa is Not a Country brings the story of the continent towards reality, celebrating the energy and fabric of its different cultures and communities in a way that has never been done before. End quote. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of Africa is Not a Country by Dipo Faloyan. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.